Hello and welcome to the Power Driven Podcast. Today is going to be freaking fun because we're talking about
turbos.
Compound turbos.
Compound
Turbos.
That's right.
Specifically compound turbos.
Yeah, this is going to be really cool because we sent out a question request over our Instagram for what do you guys want to know about turbos. So we're going to give you our information. Plus, we're going to answer a bunch of questions that maybe you guys would think of that we wouldn't even think to answer, but we definitely know the answer.
We could go on for probably 12 hours talking about compound turbos. So you guys riled us in to actually talk about what you care about.
Yeah, it's a good thing because who knows where we'd go with this thing. In a long time. Turbos, I mean, just full disclosure, it's my favorite thing about diesels is they have turbos. I love turbos before I had diesel trucks. I used to have a Suzuki Hayabusa, and I dreamed about turbocharging that thing. I told my wife that my bike was sick and it needed an inhaler. I referred to my turbos as an inhaler, and she's like, I don't know about that. I'm like, no, I need one. So, but life moves on. I got kids, and the bike became impractical, so I had to go for the diesel route so I could play with turbos. So, turbos actually drove me to diesels because they had turbos, because I love turbos so much.
So you gave up a Hayabusa for a diesel.
For a 215 horsepower. First time I had Florida, I was less than impressed. We'll say that.
You're like, this is the Holy Grail 12 valve, and you're
right.
like, where's the power?
Like, this thing's awful. Where's my bike? But yeah, so I did. That's my introduction to diesels because turbochargers were so fun, and I went deep into it. Like later on, I went way in the math. We'll discuss that further. But I played with spreadsheets and I went crazy. But long story short, I freaking love turbos, and I always have.
So my first thought when I think about turbos is in other industries, they hear how much boost we run, and they're like, that's insane. And my first question to you guys, even though I'm not moderating this thing, why, 20 pounds of boost, that's insane on other applications. Why is 20 pounds stock in most diesel applications?
Well, because we can. There's no throttle on the diesel engine, and they don't care about air-fuel ratios. They can run lean like crazy. They don't detonate, so the more air, the better. And we try to run these on the lean side of the AFR curve, and so that's, otherwise you're smoky. So the factories definitely want to have a lean side, a lean burn, and so they want all the other they can get through that thing. Mm-hmm. It's a basic long story of that one. But today, like I said, we're talking compound turbos. That's really the topic of the day. We can go about single turbos later, but the questions are compound turbos. First of all, Myer, what is a compound turbo setup?
So a compound turbo setup is it's a 2 turbo configuration where you have a small turbo that it gives you your drivability that gets fed by a second larger turbo that gives you your mass air moved. And so those two turbos combine together to create a setup that spools very similar to the smaller turbo, but makes the power very similar to the bigger turbo.
And by mass air removed, you're talking your big horsepower.
Big horsepower, yep.
Now, there's some terminology you should probably know. A lot of people refer to these as twin turbos on diesels, which, you can decide whether it's accurate or not. As long as you know what you're talking about, I think it's accurate. But technically, it wouldn't be the true sense of twin turbos from the gasoline.
There are identical twins, and then there are twins. I'm the fan of saying, we know what you mean. You don't have to hype on it. It's okay.
It's okay. You call twin turbos, I'm not going to get after you. Some people are, they're not twin turbos. Well, I know what you're talking about, so I'm good. There's also, they have the primary charger. There's all kinds of different terms over the years that people have used. The first stage, second stage. Go ahead.
I don't like the primary because, in my head, the primary should be the small charger, but no, it's the big charger. Because I was like, the primary one, the one you're primarily driving on is the small charger. So I always try to refer to it as the manifold charger. So the manifold charger is always going to be your smaller turbo, and then the atmosphere charger. That one's the one sucking in atmosphere. It's very self-explanatory. It's really hard to get that wrong.
And I've always liked the terminology of stages of compression, the first stage of compression and the second stage of compression. So the first stage would be the large turbo for me. That's what's drawing air from the atmosphere. And the second stage would be drawing air from the larger turbo and compressing it again. So the second stage of compression would be the small turbo. That's how I always use my terminology.
And I'm different than both of you. I like to call the big turbo the atmosphere turbo because it's sucking from atmosphere. And I like to call the second turbo the high pressure turbo.
Or manifold turbo.
Yeah. Because that one's dealing with the higher pressure.
Yeah, high pressure, low pressure. So there's
all three of them.
They're all correct. They're all fine. So hopefully, as we use those terms, you'll know what we're talking about.
You'll know what we're talking about, yeah.
First off, the questions we get a lot is how do you size turbos? That's a big thing. There's so many turbos you can choose from. Sizing turbos is a big deal. This is something I went into really heavy years ago. Before Power Driven Diesel, I got a bunch of books, how to do the math involve the turbocharging, how to do the math involve the intercooling and how that affects everything. And there's a very popular term you've heard on the internet probably called air density. I am your density. And I discovered the importance of density on an Excel spreadsheet years ago. As I put the math in and I started working the numbers, I discovered at really high pressure ratios, meaning really high boost numbers, an intercooler is as effective as a turbocharger. Like there's so much heat that you can actually add as much density with an intercooler as you can with a turbo system. So when I put the Godfather, I considered it 4 stages of density or compression you want, because every stage added as much as the other. The turbo, it's amazing to see on numbers how important an intercooler is, especially when the pressures get really, really high because the temperatures get crazy hot. And so anyway, that's kind of my story.
Just to clarify that, he says 4 stages of compression because he had
of densification.
Two GT55s working like in parallel, feeding into a intercooler, which fed into another GT55, which fed into another intercooler. So that's 4 stages. And so like when we were on like, say the UCC dyno, I think those are the numbers I remember, we were doing like around 220 pounds of boost at about, what was it, like, I think it was 70 or 80 degree inlet temps. Was maybe under like 100.
It was right around 100.
Okay,
yeah.
100. Yeah. So like you run that in a spreadsheet, that is some dense air.
It was crazy. And so
I mean, I remember some peaks that actually get closer to 230.
Yeah.
But,
Oh, gosh, yeah.
But, I mean, that's a lot of density, 230 pounds of pressure at that low of temperature.
And that was like back when we thought we needed to like wastegate a bunch in order to drop boost. And so that was like gates wide open, like just trying to control boost.
that was a mistake. I should have ran all the boost.
Live and learn.
You learn as you go. And the things we were telling you today, we'll probably know more next year than we know today, but we're going to give you the best we got today. So
what if you're a listener and you don't even understand how compounds work? Like how does the exhaust flow? Which one does it hit first? You know, is that too technical for us? Or
I feel like
are we
there's a
gonna
lot
tell
of
people?
good like YouTube videos or anything like where you can get a really good visual, but ultimately the exhaust from the engine goes through the small turbine and then it decompresses a little bit and goes through the big turbine, whereas the intake air gets sucked in from the big compressor and then gets shoved into the small compressor and then that gets shoved into the engine. Like very simply.
Now, a lot of people have argued that's backwards. You should put the big turbo first because that gets the hot exhaust out of the energy, you know, the hot exhaust energy, and then you go in the small turbo.
So you got to remember that air compresses. And so I think about how many, like they call it 1 milk jug worth of air leaving the engine, it's going to decompress across that first small turbine into, let's just call it 2 milk jugs worth of air. Well, now you got 2 milk jugs worth of air. Now you can feed a bigger turbine with that. So that smaller turbine can utilize that smaller volume. The bigger turbine can utilize that bigger volume. If you try to flip those 2 turbines around, now you have this big turbine trying to utilize 1 gallon of air, not really doing much with it, and now it's going to decompress to 2 gallons, 2 milk jugs worth of air, and it's going to try to go and sneak through this small turbine. It's just not.
And we're talking on the exhaust side.
On the exhaust
Yeah.
side.
And then you have the exact opposite problem on the boost side.
Hold on real quick. I want people to understand, back to your milk jug theory, I just think it's very good. And so the way a turbine works is a pressure differential, pressure in versus pressure out. And so when you have more pressure on the one side versus the other side, it's going to spin the turbo. And so if you were to put a small turbo behind a large turbo, you're going to lose that pressure differential because you're going to back up that big charger, and there's not going to be a pressure differential. So basically, you just put a big block in front of your small turbo.
Yeah, it's like going to snuff that big charger.
Yeah,
it's
it's
not
just
going to let
like-
it breathe.
No, it's not going to do anything because the pressure behind it is going to be as great as the pressure in front of it. It'll do nothing.
It'd be like putting a 1-inch tailpipe on your 3-inch exhaust system on your car. Let's put a little 1-inch chrome tip on the end. To just really, really
Get the
sit
velocity
at home.
going
Back
or
pressure
whatever
matters.
it is. Yeah. No. But
The same thing
yeah.
on the air side. It's like trying to inhale through a straw. If that big turbo has to suck the oxygen in through the little one.
And that's what's like really important. Like people try to size turbos, whatever, and that's kind of where we're getting into here is like sizing compounds. You got to remember the atmosphere charger is going to have to deal with about twice as much volume as the manifold charger. And so if with no other information, you kind of have to keep in mind that that turbo has to be able to consume about twice as much air as the manifold charger.
Yeah. So quickly before we move on to that, I do want to talk a little bit about the compressor side of the turbos. We talked about the exhaust. And so what you need to realize is turbos are just a multiplier. Then when I say the word pressure ratio, that's literally multiplying the pressure it receives. So if you have the atmosphere, let's call it 1 bar. You've probably heard that term before. And your turbo's putting out 2 bar. then you have a 2-to-1 pressure ratio. It doubled the pressure that it receives.
And we like using bar because bar is basically about 1 atmosphere worth of pressure.
Yeah.
And so that's 14.5 PSI. Now, now you went from
14.7. In Missouri, it's 14.5.
Bar is 14.5. I will win this one. Anyway, so you're taking approximately atmosphere air and you're turning it into 14.5 PSI gauge pressure, which is 29 PSI total overall.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, pressure ratio is a multiplier. Turbos are multipliers. People say, I'm adding boost. You're not. You're multiplying the pressure that it receives. And so when you do that, it adjusts the CFM requirements of the system. So if your engine consumes naturally aspirated, no turbo, let's say it consumes 100 CFM at 2,000 RPM. This is terrible numbers, but it's very simple. And so now if you get to 2-bar, your turbo now multiplies it by 2, it consumes 200 CFM to feed that 100 CFM at 2-bar. Your engine still only moves 100 CFM. It doesn't change. It's just density. The density is more dense. And so we've taken 200 CFM of atmosphere and fit that into 100 CFM of space. That's basically how a turbo works. Mm-hmm. And now compounds just do it again. So now I have 200 CFM intake of that first turbo. Now, if I go to 2-bar from the big turbo, now I need 400 CFM of atmosphere to feed 200 CFM into that turbo, which then condenses that 200 CFM to 100 CFM. So now I have 400 CFM of atmosphere going through a 100 CFM motor. Mm-hmm. And that's the beauty of compounds, is you can just get ridiculous amounts of air through that tiny engine that does not flow very well, but we're just pushing it through. Mm-hmm. I love turbos.
So I guess your mom.
So some people say, why can't you just do that with one turbo? Because I see some of these street outlaw guys, they're pushing 70 pounds of boost with a single Pro Charger or a single turbo. Why?
You can. We've done that as well on our big turbos, but you need a very large turbo to provide that much pressure to that engine. And so in order to have that large of a turbo on an engine, it's going to be a race motor. Like we've done that. There's a lot of people who do that in the race classes, GT55 on the manifold, and they're pushing 70 up to 100 pounds of boost out of a single charger, which is insane. Those chargers even live there. It's incredible. But you have to have a turbo that can support that amount of flow. And that means you have a big old fat turbo on the side of your engine.
That
it's
is
not going to drive well.
You're going to hate it on the street.
At that size charger, if you want boosts on the street, you've got to be above 3,000.
So let's get back to the question at hand. How do you size turbochargers? We have a basic idea of how it works. And so we talk to people all the time when they call us, and there'll be some questions. If you don't get answered, call us, and we'd love to talk to you at the shop. We can help you more specifically. But in general, your RPM range really, for me, dictates your turbo sizes. What do you think, Myer?
So if you decided to go compounds and that's the way you want to go, to me, you want to go with the atmosphere charger that supports your power goal, and then your manifold charger kind of dictates what you're doing with the truck. Let's just use an example here. If this is like a work truck, something you drove every day, response is a really good, like something you really, really want, I would try to keep a stock turbo on the manifold or a stock frame size charger.
Yeah. Maybe
a little bit bigger turbine. Compounds love turbine wheels just because of like letting that exhaust out, because it does now need to go through 2 of them. So going a little bit bigger on the turbine can help it a little bit, but ultimately keeping a factory turbine or factory turbo on the manifold, and then pick your big charger to be able to support your goal. Like let's just say you're trying to shoot for, 1,000 horse is a little bit of stretch. Let's go 1,000 horse. That would be a stock turbo and a 480. That's going to tow well. That's going to do really well on a 12 valve doesn't really have enough. Like when you're towing with it, trying to tow with a 480, it's a good setup. It's definitely, the 480 is a little big for trying to tow with, especially at 2,000 RPM or something, but it would tow fine. The 351 or HX35 would, take over down below. Anyway, now if you're trying to have like a fun setup, now you're going to want to bring your RPM up. That's going to get rid of some torque, make your engine live a little longer. It's not going to be as fun on the street. It's not going to tow as well, but now you can upsize your manifold charger and help get a little bit more air flow through the engine up at the higher RPM. So now you're going to like an S300 or something. And so there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, I want to go back to your HE351 or HX35 example. So those are stock turbos on Dodge trucks. Mm-hmm. And you would want to keep a stock one because it would keep your response well. Like you did this for years, even in your drag truck, you had a 351 on your drag truck.
Yeah, so in the class that I raced at, I wanted my truck to be able to spool very quickly the starting line so that I could play starting line games with the competitors. I didn't want, because a lot of people had a hard time spooling, and I'm like, well, if my truck doesn't have a hard time spooling, that's a competitive advantage. And so, and I was poor, and stock turbos are pretty cheap. I mean, there's more than one. But so I ended up racing with my 12 valve. I put a stock turbo off a 2006 truck on there, and that got me to, let's say, 450 horsepower, but I needed 700 to race the class I wanted. So I slapped a great big old 83 millimeter whole set. HT4B is the exact
Classic
model.
turbo back in the day.
Slap that under there, and I mean, to most people, that was a disproportionately. They're like, "How on earth can you spool that big turbo?" Well, the other advantage with compound turbos people don't realize at first is once that little turbo is feeding, let's say, 15, 20 pounds of boost into my little, 12 valve, 5.9 liter Cummins, it's exhaling exhaust as if it's a 10 liter engine. A 10 liter engine can spool an HT4B just fine because that's what it was designed to run. Well, it's designed to run on a 19 liter engine, but still a 19 liter engine. Anyway, I digress. And I had a lot of success running that small turbo with a great big one on top.
I remember when I was like on the forums talking about the turbo system I was going to make. My first triple turbo system was a GT4202 with 2 GT55s, and people thought I was so stupid. Like, you will never get that to spool. That will never work. I'm like, at this point in my life, I had never built one. I couldn't say yes, it will, but I'm like, the math shows it'll be fine.
Give us millimeters on the compressor side so people understand that don't speak Garrett turbos.
So I had the 4202 is a 72 millimeter at that point in time. They're 76 now, but it's a 72 millimeter compressor, and the two atmospheres were both 106 millimeter compressors.
Oh my god!
So I had two 106s paired with a 72, and I had the intercooling we talked about between stages, and I had the intercooling after. You call that the intercooling and aftercooling for the real technical nerds out there. So I had intercooling and aftercooling, yeah, they're like, there's just no way it'll work. You're an idiot. I'm like, I'm gonna try, man. I don't know. So
hadn't you already tried that 4202 as a single turbo before?
I've been running
so
the
you knew
spool is
you
fine.
could spool it just fine as a single turbo.
But they would say, that your atmosphere is too big. It'll never work. And that kind of goes to another question right here: is can the atmosphere charger be too big? I mean, yeah, it can be, but just know I had no problems spooling those two GT55s, and I made north of 2,000 horsepower with that setup, that 4202. And then I just wanted more, so we kept going bigger and bigger on the atmosphere, or on the manifold, or the second stage, or the the high pressure. I went bigger and bigger on the small stage, and it worked better because my RPM range went up. But it spooled fine.
Now, I remember back in the day in testing, you were trying to see how small you could go
Yeah.
on the manifold with how big you could go on the turbo. And I recall at one point you had ran a GT35,
Yep.
which is basically an HX, basically a stock size
Ball bearing
turbo
HX35 is what it is.
with a GT55.
I
right?
did.
With a
Yeah, on
106.
a 12 valve.
So you've gone basically a stock to the biggest turbo you can currently buy, in the normal frame size
Yeah.
of,
Without going crazy. And shocker, it worked. So it's just like Will said, once that little turbo gets going, you get 3 bar, that 6 liter engine's now an 18 liter engine. And 18 liters can do a 106, no problem.
Yeah. So ultimately, what it comes down, like, if you're trying to make, let's just say, 1,000 horsepower, don't put a charger on that's capable of 2,000 as an
Right.
atmosphere, but put the charger on that will make that power. That's ultimately
Yeah.
the thing. And I have a rule of thumb that I use when I'm trying to get an idea of 2 turbos, if they're going to work or not. I want the manifold charger, the small charger, to be able to, if you were to run that charger as a single, I want it to be able to make between, call it 55%, or between 55% to call it maybe 65% of my total power goal as a single. So if I'm making a 1,000 horse compound setup, I want that atmosphere charger. I want the manifold charger to be able to make between, call it 500 to 650 or whatever, in order to have a good, well-rounded compound set. Because if that manifold charger is capable of 800 horsepower on its own, and I'm trying to compound it to get to 1,000, I really haven't utilized
the compounding effect.
Compounding effect, the bonus of compounds, where you can get crazy drivability with big airflow.
Awesome power.
And so and you can put two turbos that are very similar size next to each other. And like in racing applications, there's arguments why that would be good. You get two massive turbines that lets the air out of the engine. You get maybe some better high RPM performance. But for like a good street rig, get those two turbos, space them out. Give yourself you're getting the good of the manifold charger, the good spooling attributes. Capitalize on that. Put a nice small turbine on the manifold to get it to spool.
In my head, I still can't understand two similar sized turbines in a compound arrangement. I feel like you're just leaving. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm just saying you could build something that works better.
Yeah.
Because
if you're justifying putting a GT55 on the manifold, get wild with the atmosphere.
Yes, exactly. Well, I don't know. I do one GT55 into another GT55. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm just saying you could do better, but I mean there are space constraints that you got to and weight constraints. So I'm not saying it's the wrong answer. In my mind, I just feel like there's got to be a better solution. But that's a topic.
We're trying to stick with the 90% of normal. If somebody's putting 8 kits of nitrous in there, maybe they need sense. A GT55 in the manifold because they just can't keep the shaft and the bearings alive, and so they're sacrificing what it could do naturally aspirated for reliability. But for the 90% of people.
Mm-hmm. I do want to go back. Those out. I do want to go back still. There's one point I wanted to talk we haven't hit yet. You're talking about the stock frame size charger, maybe modified with a 480. You mentioned how it'll tow fine, but it might not be ideal. And I want to talk about that right now because most of the guys who call us are looking for something that's going to work well, towing well. And the stock turbo 480 is much different than our towing compounds, which is in the 12 I have a stock turbo 369 and the common rail is a stock turbo 472. Mm-hmm. And the reason we made those turbos smaller than the 480 is for response time at the RPM range people are towing.
Yep.
It's a big difference putting a 480 on a compound set for towing versus a 472. You run a 472 or did for a long time on your truck.
Yeah, I mean, I've had quite a few towing compound setups on my truck. And I mean, there's a big. I used to tow with I used to have a stock HX35 and an HT3B. That's the little 72 millimeter small brother of the HT4B out of my race truck. The 4B ran so well, I was like, I'm going to put a 3B on my tow truck. Well, it ended up being actually it was an HT60, but
whatever.
What's a 60 and 3B amongst friends? They're all the same turbo basically, But that setup, I put on the dyno. I thought this was great. It barely would break 500 horsepower. It'd make like 525. That's all it could get. It was, and I'm like, here my race truck's sitting here making 700 plus, no problem. And I
remember that turbo, that little red. It was red, right?
Yeah, it was a cute little turbo, and it felt like the truck was always smothered, like it was choking on exhaust. Had a really tight exhaust housing on the big turbo, like 21 centimeter. But I will tell you, at 1,500 RPM, going up the mountain, towing. I used to live in Las Vegas. I go up to Mount Charleston. When I'm driving up that mountain with any single turbo, I would have coolant temp problems because I'd be hovering 1,200 EGT empty running up that hill. It was just the wrong RPM range for my 5-speed between 4th and 5th gear. It was just the gear splits. It was just rough. Once I put that compound set up, I could go up that whole mountain, 950 EGT, and it had plenty of power, it'd run cool, and the coolant would stay cooler because we were putting so much more air through the engine. But that same setup, when I tried to, race it down the drag strip, it was barely faster than the single HE351 I was running before on it. And I was like, it was eye-opening. But if I was towing and I was in, let's say, California, where I couldn't go over 2,000 RPM, that was the best towing setup at that point in my life, before power driven to come along, obviously, that worked well. Later, I wanted more horsepower. So what did I do? I put an HE351 on the manifold and then a 480. All of a sudden, now I go down the drag strip. It wasn't choking on the exhaust. It was better. But I take that same trip up to Mount Charleston. Now I'm hovering at like 1,100 EGT. Better than the single turbo, but not as good as that smaller compound setup.
And I feel like up until this point, we've talked about why do you get compounds? Because you can combine the big mass of air that a big turbo can move and then the drivability of a small one. But when it comes to towing, there's a whole nother bonus to compounds. And that is turbo recovers energy from the exhaust. And so if you can have 2 turbos, you're now recovering, I mean, not twice as much, but you have more efficiency of that exhaust. You can now get more power from it or more energy from it, and that can then go in and make more boost. And so even if you have the same amount of heat energy coming out of the exhaust, 2 turbos can harness more of that energy, feed more boost in, and now you've cooled off your engine. And you've got that compounding effect of just simply from a efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, and this actually answers another question. One of the questions here is like, is compound turbos worth it if 400 horsepower is your goal? And you kind of already answered that in your towing. Like, yeah. I mean, 400 horsepower, you can make it very easily on a dyno or hot rodding around with a single, sure. But you're not going to tow very well with 400 horsepower, nowhere near as well as compounds or any power level.
If you have a 12 valve, you won't keep that cool. The cooling system is there. So you can't run 1200 EGT anyway.
Yeah.
You need these small compounds you're talking about, because if you can keep that exhaust temp down at 950 or 1000, you probably can maintain 400 horsepower towing.
Yeah, and that's why we made the ultimate towing kit that way, because we know full well there's way more powerful kits out there.
Yeah.
But most guys who are calling us wanting a kit want to tow their trailer better.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of like what we come up with, is really, really good manners. Yeah, it's not a huge horsepower kit, but it's an amazing towing kit. Maybe some other kits are coming in the future. We definitely want to do that. We like that, but we knew this is the one that had the biggest need. And so even though it's not like the fun one to talk about, it really pulls the trailer really dang good.
Yeah, and it just, I mean, if you've ever towed with a single charger, I mean, lots of you guys have, like, you're pulling a grade. I mean, if you're pulling a grade at 30 pounds of boost, like, you're overheating. Like, there's no way your EGTs are good. Unless you have, like, an aftermarket charger that's, like, got big turbine, whatever, you lost some drivability, but maybe in that one situation at whatever RPM it is, it's able to do decent. Well, with compounds, you can have the factory charger manners. Like my old 12 valve was my tow truck. It has some junkyard compounds on it. It's not great. However, being compounds, my tow tune, I think dyno's at like 360 horsepower. They're just like, I have a tow tune built into the AFC Live. And so then I can just cruise control. I can floor it. I can go up any grade. Generally, with a little 20-foot trailer with another truck on it, I can maintain speed up any grade here in Utah that I found so far. And it does great. Coolant temp stays right there under control. And it's awesome. Like 1200 degrees, about 35, 40 pounds of boost, and that's where it cruises, and it does great. And that's that's really hard to achieve with a single charger while also having like good manners.
Yeah, for sure.
So tell us about your street truck that you tow with. How much boost does that make going up the hills when you're
Are you
towing?
talking to me?
Yeah, you make a count.
So speaking of sizing turbos, this thing has a 467 GT55. Continue.
Yeah. It's perfect. It's the best compound system ever made for a guy like me.
But you're towing, there's times you're at 60 pounds of boost, right?
I will be 60 pounds of boost going up Black Ridge, which is like the big hill around here. It's not huge, but it's a decent grade. And I'll be 60 pounds of boost, 1050, 1100 degrees EGT. But that's because I got turbine flow like crazy, and I also have that ported head, which lets the exhaust out. That thing made a huge difference.
And you're towing in overdrive at
Towing
what,
fourth
85?
gear, 85 miles an hour, about 2450, 2500 RPM.
And that's towing your enclosed race trailer with the race truck in it. Yeah,
Yep.
with all tools and all that
Tools
stuff.
and
Who knows what it
everything.
weighs, but
I don't know. It's
light.
not the trailer itself is is pretty heavy, so it's not. I mean, it's not like a hot shotter taking these massive loads across but it's as heavy as I'm going to ever tow.
But getting back to the point, can you go too big? That arguably is that's a race compound setup for a lot of people. That is too big. However, because it's so big with that engine and tuning combination, your exhaust temp drops the more throttle you're giving as you're coming up the mountain.
Yeah, it'll climb, and then the cruise will give it more fuel. The EGT will climb, and then it'll just drop. I mean, I'll go like 1200, and then
Because it's
it comes
like the
1050.
turbines have so much energy. They're so capable of making boost. Normal, like if you were make that same exact power with smaller turbo setup, you'd be pushing them further out of the efficiency range. And so it'd be less efficient and the boost would be 40 pounds instead of 60.
Yeah.
But because those turbos are just happen to be so happy right there, they're just idling
Yeah,
at 60 pounds of
They're
boost.
just cruising. There's so much airflow with that GT55, and the 467 works really well on that 6.7 platform. That it continually amazes me how well it works. Honestly,
It honestly pisses me off. Like here I have like a decent towing setup, like what the internet would tell you would be a good towing setup. And I'm like, dude, this guy, like,
So what we found is when you have an excess of oxygen or more turbo than you need, the engine continues to pick up efficiency. It burns that fuel even more efficient the more excess air. I have found one situation where getting back to this stupid junker drag truck of mine, when we first had a dyno and we were playing with it, do you remember I had that flat spot around 600 horsepower?
Yep.
And it's basically where it was transferring over from the small turbo to the big turbo. And if I let that wastegate open too quickly on the manifold or the high pressure turbo, it would start to slow down and my power would plateau. And the big turbo wasn't really at, it was going, but it wasn't, in its peak efficiency. And so I had a flat spot, and that's kind of when we came up with that turbo tuner that we had.
Yeah.
So that we could
because you had an
tune that
internal
wastegate.
wastegate on that one. And so we had to find a way to tune the internal wastegate. And so that's actually another question. People are asking, how do you set up wastegates? How do you do wastegates on these things? And there's two types: the internal wastegate, which comes on like your stock turbos, it's already there. And then if you go to like bigger turbos like mine, the 467 or S400, even S300s, you can kind of get internal. But the bigger turbos do not have wastegates in the housings. And so then people put them in the exhaust manifold to wastegate. And what a wastegate does is it diverts exhaust around the turbine. So, it limits your boost. So the factories put them there to limit boost, to, keep the turbo speed at reasonable speeds. And that's what they're for. So in compounds, what is your recommended wastegate philosophy, if you will?
So that's kind of blurry. So generally, I run like two turbos that are very differently sized, and for that, you do, especially with like a tight housing on the manifold charger, and because there's a big size difference there, you generally do want to run gates. And so generally, we find you make the most power in that type of arrangement, gating as much as you can, at least through an internal gate or one external gate. Like you got 4 gates, that might be too much, but through one gate, you want to gate as much as you can, but you have it come on too early, and it snuffs the big charger. Like the small charger's trying to hand off control to the big charger, but the big charger's not ready yet. And so what I tell people, and it's easy to see on a dyno, but set up a GoPro in your cab and take it for a rip. Like I drove my truck for a couple weeks before I was videoing, just put it on the gram or something, and I watched the video back, and I'm like, when I floored it, the boost came up to, call it 40 PSI. It kind of hovered there for a second and then continued on. I'm like, oh, that gate's opening too early. It's trying to hand off control before that big turbo's ready for it. So anyway, that's what I found, like, for being able to tune wastegates on the street. Get a GoPro, shove it at your boost gauge, and watch it. And if it's hesitating at a certain boost number, like, yeah, sure, it's going to hesitate till you get to like 10, 20. It should skyrocket from there. If there's a hesitation right there at the top of the manifold charger, so like 30, 40, 50, whatever PSI, and then it keeps going, that gate's opening too early.
Now, what about, because we've tuned lots of compounds on the dyno, if that handoff is not tuned perfect and everything's not perfect, you're giving up power in the middle of the power band for a little bit while those turbos are going. But up in the top end of the turbo flow, is there a huge difference with the wastegate wide open, half open, all the way closed?
So I would
on
say,
most setups.
I would say
I wouldn't say
there's
huge.
a little bit.
There is, but not huge.
So like on example of the junker drag truck, we have a 351 480 compounds on that. It's a 62 67.
Now we do it. We've changed turbos many times. Keep people following. Right now it has
it's
a 351.
It's a 351
or 62 millimeter 351.
Yep, 62 67 HE351 with a 480. And we found the more open that gate could be, the better. And they would make a little bit more power. And we probably picked up with just hogging out the gate, like we were doing gate, like wastegate testing, whatever. So we put a stock housing on there, and then we hogged out the gate to like one of our current ones, and that picked up, call it 20, probably maybe 20, 30 horsepower. Then we had, changed the gating strategy, got to open even more, and then we may have picked up another like 10 horsepower from that. But that made 30, 40 horsepower worth of difference, which isn't nothing. Like that's good.
That's free power.
And when we first put it on the truck, we just like threw it on there and just dynoed it, and that gate was opening too early, and you could absolutely tell. Like just because it hesitated, it did not make the torque.
But the peak power, it still made
900
plus,
or whatever. Yeah,
and it didn't quite get over 1,000 at the end. So it's not like if your gate
is
tuning is way off that you're giving up tons of peak power, but you are giving up meat or power in the middle of your power range. Where those turbos are.
Area under the curve will be less.
It's like one of those things you don't really realize what you're giving up until you get it. And you're like, wow, yeah, I can feel the difference there. Now, I actually want to go back, first of all, to Todd, your 467 GT55 setup. Two things. First of all, you're not gated. You have a 9.0 on the manifold. Like, it works pretty good.
I want a simple setup.
Makes 1,500 horse and tows really well. Everyone's going to be like, wow, I'm going to get rid of my tow truck setup, and I'm going to go to GT55 and a 467. So why wouldn't you do that? I want to go over a couple things here. First of all, you have a 6.7 swapped third gen. So you got a lot more cubes that can drive that 467, that can drive that GT55 better than a lot of other people.
That any 5.9 ever could.
Yeah, correct. And you have a 48 RE in there. So when
Yep.
you're in overdrive cruising up Black Ridge, you're at 2,400 RPM
24,
still.
2,500, yeah.
373s, 32s.
Yeah, exactly. I got
40,
some RPM.
2,400. You've got the RPM band, and so you can utilize it.
I also have a full manual valve body where I can
Yep.
control the engine RPM, myself.
What I'm trying to say is, like, I have a 68 in my tow truck.
Yep.
I'm same exact situation. I'm at 1,900 RPM.
Yeah.
I don't think it would go well for me with that same turbo
No,
setup.
you'd have.
I'd be under the Charger.
You would be a little bit. I mean, it would work.
It would work, but it would not be
You'd
an
probably be
ideal
grabbing
tow
in
truck.
fifth. You'd probably be downshifting
Yeah.
on the column. Who wants to do that?
So the big difference there is your tow speed. If you're in Utah where you can tow at 85,
Yeah.
that's a lot different than if you're in California. You can only tow, was it 55? They only let you go.
Yeah,
tow?
that'd be pretty
55
rough. That'd be pretty
Yeah.
rough.
Which it's like at that speed, you wouldn't need to be making 60 pounds. Like, it's not like for Todd's specific tow truck, it is a really good towing setup. Like, if you were trying to make a dedicated tow truck, like
It's
turbo
not
setup,
the system.
I like for your truck though, I think it's like pretty
about
darn
as good as-
good.
yeah,
But
it's about as
for
good as you
the
get.
other 95% of people, it's probably not the play. Another thing is, like, we're talking about common rails, like your 6.7, even if you had a 5.9, well, 12 valves especially, they require a lot of boost in order to move air and in order to make power. So if you're having a towing setup, a common rail might do really good with a 480 or a bigger turbine atmosphere charger, because all it needs to do is make 20, 30 psi of boost, and it can tow very, very respectfully.
Yeah.
12 valves need pressure in order to move that air, and so that's why a 480 is a little bit much. I mean, we're talking not even GT55. Even a 480 is a little bit much on a tow setup, because it's a little bit outside of its range. Like, that turbo's wanting to focus more at like the upper twos, and you're trying to tow at like 2,000. And that 480 is not quite happy. You're not getting that energy out of the exhaust that like a 472 or a 369 could.
Yeah.
And so that's part of, like, when you're trying to do size compounds for your towing, you got to keep in mind, okay, what's my actual RPM I'm trying to tow at, and be kind of realistic with that turbo size.
We are kind of talking about like total optimized setups, though. I would argue that Junker's 351 480 setup will tow better than any single turbo you
Oh,
can
yeah,
put on a 12
for
valve.
sure.
A 351 itself is a good towing charger, and then you put that 480 behind it. Yeah, you're going to utilize and be able to capture a little bit more energy out of the exhaust. But we're talking about like a dedicated tow truck, I wouldn't do a 480 on the atmosphere.
Correct, but I'm just saying the average person, if they go put those on, they're going to
yeah.
love
Oh, wow.
it compared to their single turbo.
A little
But-
disclaimer: that's the setup my dad's truck has. I put a 472. I put an
351.
AT351 472 on there, made mid 700s, and I was like, dude, we could probably crack 900 if we put a 480 on there. I sold it to him. I was like, dude, it's going to make a little bit less torque, make a little bit more horsepower. It's going to have better reliability. And now it has that on it. And it tows well, but it definitely, like, if you're trying to tow at 1,600 RPM, you are below that 480.
It was better with the 472.
It definitely was better
That's a
with
stroker
472.
mode. That's a stroker. That's a 6.1, not a 5.9.
Yeah, but we live in Utah where you're cruising at 2,000 RPM or above if you're towing,
Yeah.
and like it still has a 351 on the manifold, a big turbine 351. So even when that 480 is not going, it's still very respectable. But it's only doing maybe 300 horsepower versus, like, when we were doing towing simulations on the dyno, I had it held at 1,200 degrees at like 2,200 RPM. I looked over and I was making 600 horsepower.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
Like,
The-
it does good.
Yeah. You did bring up a great point that actually is one of our questions here. You talked to your father and said, hey, I'll put a 480, less torque, more reliability. A lot of people are worried about reliability of their engines. You know, if I put compounds on, and we've seen this, oh, you're going to kill the reliability. I mean, all of our videos, people will get comments, you're just killing the reliability. You add the power, you kill reliability. I mean, what's your experience with that? Well, have you killed reliability compounds on your truck?
I mean, having a stock engine with only head studs, 350,000 miles, and we're talking stock bearing. The engine had never been apart. No problems. So
No problems.
no, reliability is not given up. You keep up on your oil changes and regular maintenance. That engine looked a lot better than cores we get with the same mileage on them
Oh,
that
yeah.
were abused with dirty air filters and bad oil changes. And it didn't need to be rebuilt. I just was going to take it to that over 1,000 horsepower.
Yeah, you want to put a stroker motor in it, and you want to do some cool stuff. So, I mean, but it ran fine. I mean, there's no reason to take it out. I wanted to
I
upgrade.
mean, we
'cause
did a video. You can see the
Yeah.
bearings.
We did a teardown.
There was
video.
wear, but it wasn't like
I want to
half the life was gone or anything. It still had half its life left.
Yeah.
I want to talk about this a little bit more. So you're saying like bearings, everything look great, and I agree, like 100%. I have never left the chassis engine in my 12 valve, and it makes like mid 700s, and it's done that for a decent amount of time, and it does good, and it's been ran out of oil more than it's had oil in it, so it's still running and it's doing great. Not proud of that. Anyway,
We don't recommend you run your truck with no oil in it.
when you got that ZDDP, bro, you're good. Not recommended. However, when you're doing compounds, you do have to be smart about it. You are making more boost numbers or boost pressure than you would with a single charger. And so like a couple things, like you said, head studs. And if you're making good amount, you need O-rings, you need some extra form of sealing, get that head gasket to hold. A. B, you need good exhaust manifold gaskets. You will blow out the exhaust manifold gaskets on your manifold. 3, you need good intercooler boots. Like factory boots, they get soft. Even like crappy, the Chinese ones that you get for cheap, like they're soft. They'll get brittle with that high boost, high pressure, high temperature, and they'll blow out. I remember towing back from somewhere, and I blew the same boot off like darn near probably like a dozen times. Like I was to the point I was like grabbing gravel off the side of the street and like trying to coat the inside of not the inside of the boot, but the outside of the pipe, try to give it some grit so I could make it hopefully more than 10 miles before it blew it again. And like I swapped to our boots, and that took care of that. So that is like the only points I could see where you'd risk reliability. But if you just build it right, put some good parts in there, there's
you
really
should
wrong with
upgrade things along the way with it. It's a pretty substantial upgrade, compound turbos, and it probably requires some supporting mods as well. But the reality is any truck in any condition can be burned down or live a long time. It's really on how you operate the vehicle, how you talk about maintenance is a big deal. But also, don't give it to your 15-year-old kid with hot rod knowing things going to last forever. You got to drive it. If you're having a big, powerful vehicle that's designed for 200 to 300 horsepower, and now it's making 1,000 horsepower, yeah, you probably got to realize I can't live at 1,000 horsepower. I can live at 300 horsepower, all day, every day. I can't live at 1,000 horsepower all day, every day. Mm-hmm. Have fun with it, but still realize that engine is designed to live around 300 horsepower all day, every day. And that's probably about what you were for those 350,000 miles. I gave 99.9% of those miles were probably under 300 horsepower. Mm-hmm. You go take it for a rip, have some fun, tow, and then you're just driving along.
I mean, the biggest unexpected thing I'd say that failed after I had the transmission upgraded was I lost the ring and pinion in the Dana 70 and it started kind of making noise, and that's just purely when you have that much power and torque, you hit a set of railroad tracks at full throttle, the tires are going to start skipping on the pavement. You get after it if it's even slightly cold or wet, you can do rolling burnouts. And so that big torque is harder on drive shafts, U-joints, and ring and pinion.
So
but
I will combat that. I had compounds on my shorty for, I don't know, at least 20,000 miles. It made way too much torque, about 1,300 horse. I daily drove in like the 1,100, 1,200 horsepower tune. I put a single 467, went on the truck, went to Home Depot and stripped out the ring gear on the way home, which I do think was unrelated. However, it can happen with anything.
Yeah,
but question. It is, we're not going to argue and say that it's less stress on the vehicle to make more power.
When you make more power, for sure.
There's more. The head gasket, I think, becomes a little more of an issue with the compounds purely because it allows you to operate the engine in a lower RPM range than you could ever make that power density with a single turbo. So if you get it all wound up, making good boost at, let's say, 2,500 RPM, and you let that lug and pull the engine down, but the turbos are already lit, you can make that full boost probably at 1,500. Now you're making dang near 2,000 foot-pounds of torque. Yeah. That lifts cylinder heads off.
Yeah, for sure. So torque is cylinder pressure. Cylinder pressure is what blows gaskets.
And so you just need to make sure you have good head studs in there or an O-ringed head.
That's a question that's actually posed to us. At what point do you think you go from like an ARP 2000 to an ARP 625 or OptiTorque Torque Master or the OptiTorque, stainless studs that are super high end? Like, what level would you go? Say, at this point, you need the better grade studs. 6.7, probably right away.
6.7s with the VGT, they just make so much torque.
Yeah.
Yeah. That if it's like a base level motor, I don't think you need it like straight off the bottom. But if you're planning on like hot rodding it at all, you should probably get the better studs. I actually want to kick this over to Will.
To me, I'll start with 12 valve because that's kind of what I live and breathe most. And I would say you need studs around 400 horsepower. The socket cap head bolts we sell, the stainless, the nickel plated bolts, those those are fine. I've pushed them up to 500, but really the ARP or an OptiTorque Torque Master is a little bit better. But anything over 500 with compounds, if you're going to put any kind of timing in it, and I'm talking not just small towing compounds, something that you're going to, maybe make 600 horsepower with, I think you either need to go right to a stainless fastener like the OptiTorque Custom Age or ARP 625, or you need to pull the head off and put an O-ringed head on there with the stud with a hot retorque. I found a factory gasket that has a bunch of miles and is well settled with a stud put one at a time, holds a lot of power. Once you blow that, you put a new gasket on there, it won't hold the same power level until it gets a bunch of miles, and that's not going to happen. You need an O-ring.
Yeah.
So studs are really important for compounds. You remember years ago we had that truck called Oscar, that two-wheel drive Oscar truck, and we had a 369 on that, and we were beating on it. Lots of timing, lots of everything, and we were it was head bolts, stock head bolts, not head studs.
I think we got to like 520 or 550 with the 360. It's somewhere in the mid fives.
Yeah, and those were uncorrected numbers back in the day. So it's more like 600 plus for a comparable number in the world today. And we were like, this is freaking ridiculous. And it was just taking it. And we put our towing compounds on it, and the second pull on the dyno, we lost the head gasket. And that goes back to your point of like you can lug it down or you can get so much more cylinder pressure. So the torque went way higher, cylinder pressure went higher. Even though the power number wasn't higher, it blew the head gasket because we were making it such a lower RPM.
Because we were maybe at 1,000 or 1,200 foot-pounds with the single turbos, and I thought we got into the 1,400s, 1,500 maybe, and with the compounds. And so it's less horsepower, more torque, and torque is
cylinder
pressure, and that's what's lifting the head.
And people they go on forums and stuff. People think, oh, high drive pressure, that's going to blow my head gasket. Drive pressure is a sign of a small compound set or a small single that is going to make torque at low RPM, which is cylinder pressure, and that's what blows head gaskets. Drive pressure is a sign of that you have a setup that's going to ultimately be able to blow head gaskets. It's not what blows head gaskets. And that's why everyone thinks it is. It'd be like if
somebody's sweating, they're like, oh my gosh, they're sweating, they're going to have a heart attack. Well,
if
somebody's prone to heart attack, they probably are going to be sweating when the heart attack happens, but the sweating did not cause the heart attack.
Yes,
drive pressure
exactly.
did not blow the head gasket, but it is a sign or symptom that things are working hard and that. But we should talk a little bit more about drive pressure.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the questions here. People are asking about drive pressure.
What was the exact question?
It says, why don't companies talk about drive pressure and intermediate boost at all when setting up the size of their compound turbos? Well, we talk about drive pressure in every one of our turbo shootout videos. So far, most of them have been a single turbo, not in the compound arrangement, but we're big believers in drive pressure, but we don't think it's the end-all, be-all of everything.
No, like Todd talked about having spreadsheets. I also had spreadsheets. I used to be some good ones. Quite a nerd when it comes to these things. And anyway, I was like, oh, data. I made my own data logger for my 12 valve. It made I had the data logger on there before I even messed with the AFC. I was like, I'm gonna data log every single thing. Anyway, I was hardcore. I was like, I want to be able to monitor it all, drive pressure, all that stuff. Well, then I started playing around with more setups and more things, and I just realized that drive pressure it's good information to know, just kind of put in your back pocket, but it's not really something I'd hugely base setups off of. I want to know how well they rev out. I want to know how much power they make, and that's ultimately what's going to dictate setups to me. Drive pressure, it's just kind of a fun thing to know, but I don't know how much I'd actually utilize it. Here's an example. We were doing some S300 testing early on in the before times.
So these are BorgWarners.
We were trying out some. They all were S362s based chargers. They all had this exact same compressor wheel. We were trying out different housing options, different turbine wheels, just playing with different stuff to try to get what combination we wanted. And in that, we did some testing. This was on my truck with all that data logger on it, and we swapped between a couple different setups, and one of the setups, we all had them all make 42 pounds of boost. One of the setups made 5 more pounds of drive pressure, same 42 pounds of boost, but also made 50 more horse. Any kind of data nerd would be like, that's impossible. There's no way. How is higher drive pressure, same boost, creating more power? Well, the fact of the matter is, you're measuring average drive pressure.
Yeah.
The average drive pressure, I could care less what that is. That's pressure in a manifold. I don't care. Now, what I care about is the pressure in the cylinder when the piston's trying to go up. And so if you can get that energy, the exhaust out early, that's going to make a spike or whatever. It's hard to explain, but drive pressure with that information. Like after that, I was like, yeah, drive pressure is really just kind of a number that's good to know, but I'm not going to base any decisions off
kind
of
of
it.
an average number. It doesn't
It's
give
average.
you a tight snapshot of what happens every combustion cycle in the cylinder.
Like with that higher drive pressure is because we changed that. We went up with the turbine wheel and smaller with the housing. And ultimately what I've decided was the smaller housing was creating higher average drive pressure, but the bigger turbine wheel was able to swallow the pulses of exhaust better. And so that high pressure spike, when that valve's open trying to get exhaust out, that high pressure spike that actually mattered was lower, but the average was higher. And that's why I was able to do what it did. And so after that, drive pressure is cool, but it's not something I really base that much decision off of.
Yeah, it does to kind of indicate maybe are your turbo sizes in the realm. Like if you have ridiculous drive pressures, then your RPM is wrong for those turbo sizes.
Yeah, and you can use that to help decide if you're going to try to gate more, gate less. Like it's a good thing to look at and be like, maybe I can try this, maybe I can try that. But like your setup, your GT55 S467, like your drive pressure was like 1.3, 1.4 times boost.
Yeah.
And so some people would be like, oh, at 1,200 horse, that's way too much, blah, blah, blah. It's not. It works good.
Really
it has
good.
insane, like 1,200 horse on the street is squeaky clean.
Yeah.
100% squeaky clean. Like it is outrageous how well that setup runs.
It's so ridiculous. So I should just have a whole podcast on that because it works so good.
Yeah.
But it is ridiculous and it's super fun.
And that kind of like also I want to talk about a very common compound setup that people do, and that's a 472, 488. And I've heard a couple logics.
Is that called a knuckle sandwich?
I don't know exactly what they call it, but something along those lines. And I've heard a couple logics about it. One is like, oh, if you're not going to run gates, you have to have the turbines close together. He doesn't run gates. Like, yeah, if you're trying to maintain drive pressure, a 1-to-1 drive pressure, yeah, that's probably what you need. But if you just decide you don't care about drive pressure, then you can do whatever you want, pretty much. But the other thing is that people are like, oh, I have a stock bottom end 5.9. I don't want to make a lot of torque, and so I got to run a 472 on the manifold, otherwise it'll make a bunch of torque. Well, that's true. Like it's capable of making more torque with a smaller turbo, but ultimately your tuning is you can dictate that in your tuning. You can hold off fuel. You can hold off fuel till whatever point you want. You just tell your tuner like, hey, stock bottom end, I don't want to blow this up, and he will hold out fuel until whatever RPM.
The factory does that on the factory turbo will spool faster if they give it the fuel, and the factory does that to hold off torque in certain places. So it's not even like that's not a new concept. That's an OEM concept.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like Todd, it's very possible. It makes really good power. You could shift it at 3, absolutely suck it down, and it would go. And I'm sure there's been a couple times where you've done that. Well, you'll find in your tuning that if you try to do that, like it makes about 1,000 foot-pounds of torque at 2,000, and that's kind of about all it will do at that 2,000-ish range.
Now, did that tune change happen after he broke the factory crankshaft or before?
It got a little more stringent after the crankshaft.
Actually, I think the block got cracked too in the mains, right?
We don't know what happened first. We don't know. Block and crank were cracked. So what happened? What caused what? I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, but then what's nice about that setup is that because you're limiting your torque with fuel and not air, it's now squeaky clean. Like it's so much cleaner to run. Whereas when you're just trying to sit there and spool a 472 and it finally spools at 2,500 and you got around your torque, it's smoky that whole time.
Yeah, for sure. So talking about my turbo setup is kind of large. There's a question here on tips for compounding triples. I kind of started the funny thing is the very first compound setup I ever made was that triple GT55. From singles to 2 GT55s and a 4202.
So I think I'll weigh in a little bit on triples to begin with. Because you have 2 atmosphere chargers, you're getting a lot of airflow. 2 480s is huge airflow. 2 GT55s is insane.
Huger.
So if you have triples, you're jamming you have a lot of airflow potential. So you're going to have a lot of high RPM power. It's not, with those 2 turbines, it's not going to choke on the turbine side of the big turbo as early in the power range. And so to me, you're building a high RPM, unless you're doing triples with little 362s or something dumb like that. But anything serious making power, you're going to have some RPM range. So I think your manifold or your high pressure turbine, it does affect your RPM window on the top end a little bit. You can wastegate around it some, but at some point you need enough drive energy on that high pressure turbo to compress that interstage boost that's coming into it. And that turbo is not sucking low density atmospheric air. It's sucking high pressure dense air. And so I'd argue that you need, if anything with triples, you're going to size the compressor a little small for the turbine size it has. So for example, in a Borg-Warner S400, they have an 87 turbine wheel. The smallest compressor you can get in that is a 72. You can get that turbine wheel all the way up to an 80. On my race truck, I run the 72 as the high pressure turbo in that setup. Getting back into triples, you've played with a few different sizes on yours. I remember at one point we had an 88, then we went to a 98, but we've never put a 106 on as your high pressure compressor.
No, 98 is the biggest I've ever gone on the manifold.
And arguably with you interstage cooling, you probably could get away with even less compressor.
Yeah.
But I think the reason we went to the 98 is because maybe we hurt some other turbos. We had a 98 laying around. But
so when I first, like I said, I got into math heavy on turbos and intercooling calculations to know how much CFM I needed to be able to, I knew the size I needed on the small charge of the second stage of compression, and that all was based on the intercooling efficiency and the outlet of the big turbos. And so basically, when you do the math, I don't do triples because triples were cool. I found I needed over 400 pounds of air a minute. Like when I do the intercooling and all those 4 stages of densification, compression, whatever you can call it, at reasonable boost numbers I thought I could achieve, I was over 400 pounds of air a minute. And that's a pretty hard turbo to find, something that big. Even 200s is pretty big. So I had to, the 106s didn't show it that high, but the map was underrated, I believed, because you could see the compressor map. But
so you're getting that number. That's from the compressor flow map.
Yeah, compressor
so give
maps.
people some relative, like HX35's 50 pounds a minute.
Yes.
472 SXE, S400, or 475, they're a little over 100 pounds a minute.
Yeah, 480s like 120, 130 newer ones. And so yeah, if you think like, it's a 40's big, it's 120 pounds a minute. I was over 400 pounds a minute is what I knew I needed. And so I just knew I couldn't achieve that in any kind of decent turbo for any kind of decent money. I don't even. I'm sure some of the big, huge tractor classes have something that big, but I didn't know or anything about that. But I knew the GT55s would, and so really, I treated my triples as just a standard compound. I just needed 2 turbos to get the airflow I needed instead of 1, and that's how the math worked out. I didn't view it as all triples. But one benefit I have noticed, if you look at compressor maps online, go to Garrett or Borg or something, look at compressor maps, and then look at turbine maps, you'll find that compressor flow goes up as turbocharger sizes go up faster than turbine flow. So the ratio seems to get worse and worse as turbos get bigger. You'll have a less amount of turbo, per pound of air moved on the compressor side in a big turbo compared to a small turbo. I thought that was interesting. So in doing this, I get a lot of turbine flow on those 2 GT55s that if I had a single turbo that could move that 400 pounds a minute, I probably wouldn't have as much turbine flow as I do with the 2 GT55. So I will say, in most applications with triples, you do get a benefit in turbine flow. So if I was I'll bet you if we had 2 turbos that float 120 pounds a minute.
I'm gonna cut you off here. So there's 2 things I want to mention about triples. First of all, yes, they are cool.
So cool.
They suck to work on.
So bad.
So if you have a small sub 1,000 horse, I think the only reason you should do triples is because of they look cool under the hood.
Yeah.
And that's really
Show
it.
truck.
You can get a 480 GT55, whatever it is, to be able to make that power number.
Did you say a short truck or a sharp truck?
Show truck.
Oh, show truck. Okay, wait.
The second thing I was going to say is I have my personal race truck. It is a 6.7, whatever. It's got a 480 GT55 compounds on it. The GT55 mathematically flows about 240 pounds per minute of air. I'm making about 1,800 horse. Something I'm very interested in doing, and I really think is going to happen, is I'm going to do triple 480s just to play around and try out. Each 480 has 120. So that's also 240 pounds per minute of air. Mathematically, they're basically equal. However, when you start looking at turbine flow, there's about a 40% increase in turbo flow.
From the 240s versus the 1 GT55.
On the exhaust side.
On the exhaust side, yes. So if that is a topic that is interesting to you, follow along, because in the next couple months, I would assume it's going to happen. We'll have a video on it. I know the truck many times. We know what it makes.
That's going to be super
and we
fun.
can see what it does. We'll do a nice long pull to see how it carries power.
Yeah.
And because 480 suck to work on, or triples suck to work on. But I think it'll be cool.
But power
At least
is
for
fun.
data, it'll be great.
Power is fun.
So if you're curious about that, follow along.
I remember the first time I drove triples, your Frankenstein
Yeah,
truck.
yep.
I think I had to go pick up a part, and you're like, "Here, take Frankenstein." And I remember I got out on the back road over there. It was a close course in Mexico, and I started rolling into the throttle, and it just started pulling, and it got up to like 3,000. And most of my 12 valves in the past, 3,000, they really start laying over hard because they had kind of smaller compounds, and it just starts pulling harder and harder. And I'm sitting here, and I'm like letting off the throttle and still pulling harder. And I was just like, oh my gosh! Like, I was at like 3,800 RPM at like half throttle, and I'm like, it's still pulling hard. Like this is, and I think that was a 2,475s feeding
Probably the 4202.
4202. But I remember I was just like, now I know why Todd likes these triples. This thing just, the power band never ends with the big triples.
Yeah, you get that wide, long power pull. I mean, it truly is addictive, and it is awesome, but it does make things hard to work on. And that brings up probably our final point I want to talk about is people often want to know, like, how do you make turbos? If you want to build turbos in your own car or something like that, a big, huge consideration and factor you got to think about is space. Like putting triples, I had to cut the crap out of fender wells, all kinds of stuff. Like if you're gonna put triples in your car, prepare to cut it up. Like it should be a race type vehicle, or if you're doing really small turbos, okay, that's fine. But honestly, to fab compounds, you just kind of got to make it fit. There's no right or wrong answer. I mean, hook up the right places to the right places and make it fit.
On most platforms, you're just like lucky to fit it. Like luckily for Cummins and Dodge, like they put a big old area right there to be able to stuff turbos in. But
I think there was a question about like hot pipe design.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to go into.
Back into whatever fits.
Whatever fits. I personally like if this is a dedicated tow truck, I like an over-under setup. It's harder to work on, but that hot pipe's really short. You have less heat going into the engine bay. It's compact. It's easier to change the oil filter on or whatever it is. Like
an over-under setup is what for people that
would
don't
be
understand.
A stock second-gen manifold flipped upside down, putting the small turbo up, and then putting the big turbo underneath it, kind of like rearwards, and underneath it, kind of by the adapter
style.
plate. Yep, that's like super classic over-under setup.
Yep.
It's like I say, the downside to it is it's harder to work on. Great for a truck where you plan on bolting it up and not touching it for 100,000 miles, except for oil changes and whatnot. But for a race truck, I like the side-by-side setup. So that is stock big or small charger on the manifold, and then the big charger next to it, kind of over on top of the fender area. What's nice about that is it's super open. Every clamp, every bolt's really easy to get to, and it's generally easy to work on something where you're going to be probably messing with it at least once a year.
But
That's
that
the style.
hot pipe is longer.
It's longer there too, and so
that's the style I have on my tow truck. Is that style, and you do lose a battery. So I had to put expensive Odyssey battery, which is awesome and needed. It's very good, but I don't have a battery on the passenger side. There's a big old turbo in the way.
Yeah.
So anyway, as far as fabbing up stuff, I'd say just start. Try to get some way to put your turbos where you think they're going to fit and start connecting the dots. I mean, that's pretty much as simple as it gets.
Yep. What I do is I take an engine hoist. I take a dash 10 cap, weld a loop to it to be able to hang it with an engine hoist.
Yep.
Hang it somewhere, kind of like get yourself some pipes, like kind of mock it up, whatever. And I mean, generally you want the hot pipe as short as possible so it spools faster, but really it doesn't matter that much. Just make it where it's going to fit, where it's going to be easy to work on. And that's really all there is to it.
Yeah. So anyway, guys, I'm a big fan of turbos. Like I said, I have it my whole life. On compounds, you should have compounds on everything. If you drive it right, it reliably doesn't suffer. I mean, they're just better pretty much in every single way possible. And I love them.
I mean, my final thoughts, my street truck has compounds. My old school junker drag truck, it has compounds. My current drag truck, Uncle Rico, it has compounds. Why do all my trucks have compounds? And 6.1, actually, junker doesn't have 6.1 stroker. Why do they have cubic inches in compounds? Because 2 are better than 1. All right, so just leave it there.
I'm going to say that I had 5 Cummins in my my backyard this morning, and the only one of them was a single, and it was the customer's truck I drove. So yeah, compounds are life.
So anyway, if you guys have like specific questions, like for your specific vehicle, like, hey, I have this cam, this head, we couldn't touch that here in such a broad topic, but call us in here at the Shop Power Driven Diesel. We can go over specifics for your truck and make sure you get the right parts for your truck. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. And I had a lot of fun talking about turbos, I always do. And that's going to wrap us up, and we'll see you on the next Power Driven podcast.
Thanks.